All right, let's begin by taking a journey with a man. He's an older man, hair gray, sight becoming dimmer as the days go by, and he never forgets to take his morning walk. Every morning at 5 a.m., he walks down the shoreline from his house to a lonesome pier, sits down on the bench he made himself, and gets out his bucket. In his bucket, he has piles of fish, which he bought on his way, and throws the fish out to the sea to be caught and eaten by seagulls. He then kneels at his bench and prays for himself, for his friends, for those he'd known and those that had passed, and finally for the birds. Freedom. What is this concept of freedom? To Socrates, it is a removal of want, as the goal is to master the self in life. To Abraham Lincoln, those that deny it to others don't deserve it themselves. For Rosa Parks, freedom was taking action for a good that was denied for others. What is freedom to us as Christians? Freedom is a gift, a blessing from God through Christ, granting us everlasting life, protection from our innate sin. It's the ability to be released from the law given to those before us, and to cross the boundaries of culture, to spread the love of Christ and the stories of His grace on our lives to touch those we encounter. As ministers in training, we know that everyone is given this gift, right? We also know that Paul understood this, probably more than anyone, the transforming work of the gift of freedom, and thus he sees a need to address how we should handle this freedom as fellow disciples. So let's turn to 1 Corinthians 10:23 to 11:1 ESV, and we'll begin reading a discussion from Paul to the church in Corinth. While you're turning, this area was well known for its prosperity and trade, as well as its trademark for sexual promiscuity. Even saying they're living like a Corinthian was a snide way of saying that guy has some issues. So with this in mind, let's go to the passage. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you, without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your own conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of the many, they might be saved. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. From this passage on the idea of Christian freedom, I want to emphasize the point that Paul is making, that we need to have wisdom in using our gift of freedom. I said again, we need to have wisdom in using our gift of freedom. We have this wisdom by understanding that we use our freedom in three different ways: for the glory of God, for the profit of all men, and in order to imitate Christ. These 3 points are seen directly in the text, not my own ideas. Paul kind of made it easy for me. So let's go through these. Number 1, whatever you do, do to the glory of God, including exercising our gift of freedom. Of course, this should be throughout our daily lives, living in light of the fact that God has given us this wonderful freedom, and in that fact, glorifying Him with everything that we do, right? But I think Paul is also trying to emphasize the community of God and giving glory to Him through our actions with each other. To truly understand Paul's play on words here in verse 23, we have to look into the Greek. He begins each part with a sarcastic, all things are lawful, showing that, of course, we're under this freedom. We know that. But then begins to say that they're not edifying. The things we do don't build each other up. What does this mean in Greek? Well, helpful, sumero, is the idea of a group working together, not an individual, not our own, but a team effort to achieve a goal. And build up, oikodomio, is the act of building or establishing a house, in this case, God's house, right? So Paul is not just saying that it's fine to be lazy all day, every day, because it doesn't affect the person next to you. He's rather saying that that it isn't beneficial to the church. It isn't furthering God's mission. So should we really do it? What's the point of it? We can apply this concept to many different activities. I'll let your mind wander around. We know that the purpose of the church is to glorify God by being a part of his redemptive mission in the world, so we should seek to be beneficial in this in order to use our freedom wisely. Number 2, we should show wisdom and exercise of our freedom by seeking the profit of all men, as Paul says, that they might be saved. Right? To this point, I want to take another look at a man. This man was a runner from his childhood. The moment he entered high school, living in the back streets of urban New York in the 1930s, this young Italian took up a love for running and joined the track team. He trained, ran all over the neighborhood as a way to stay out of trouble, back streets, a way to accomplish something when everyone said he couldn't. He practiced every day of his life, and eventually was actually invited to compete in the Olympics for the American team. He competed his first year, and though he didn't win a medal, he was one of the youngest Olympians ever to compete. It's amazing. But then the war came. He was drafted to become a gunner on a bomber in World War II. In a horrific crash, his crew members died, and he was stranded on a raft for 47 days, barely surviving. He became a prisoner of war in a Japanese POW camp, as if it couldn't get worse, and had to fight for his freedom, defying the authority that was over the camp, until he was finally rescued by the U.S. forces. The reason I bring up this story is that this man never ceased to forget those that died while he survived. That's a common theme in World War II vets. Never once gave in to the tyranny that confronted him in the camp. And even after going home and living a renewed life, he went back to Japan to find that officer that gave his men so much grief and torture so that he could forgive. How amazing is that? This man understood what it meant to have freedom. It was taken away from him. It was earned back through blood and tears. What a beautiful picture of what Christ did for us. How amazing is it that Christ would sacrifice his own life for us? And yet how selfish are we with this amazing message? This message of everlasting life and freedom. Though we may understand and have this passion of sharing God's love as ministers, we have to make sure that we are teaching others in the church to also share this message, to share grace and give hope of freedom from sin that controls our lives from the very beginning. Finally, number 3, we should exercise our freedom in wisdom in order to imitate Christ. In his last paragraph, Paul gives an interesting view into his take on a mentor-mentee relationship, and that the latter should imitate him as he imitates Christ. What's that about? Is Paul being big-headed and egotistical? No. Rather, he's using a style of teaching that was popular in the time of philosophers and rabbis. This idea of a student submitting to the teaching of that teacher, of the one he was following, in an attempt to imitate their thoughts and their teaching, following as close as they could. Even the disciples were a part of this style. But what really makes this interesting, as it always does, in the Greek that Paul uses, the phrase that he uses here is memete mu geneste. Literally, become imitators of me. Again, the English doesn't fit it well. It still seems kind of selfish. But looking at exactly what the connotation of this genete is, right? It has on the realm of its connotation, it has a miraculous feeling, right? Paul is understanding that the only reason that he's looked up to, the only reason that he is able to write these passages, write these letters to these churches, is because of the miracle of Christ saving his life and giving him freedom. Because of this Damascus experience, because of this incredible turn. Thus, he also tells us to realize how wonderful it is that Christ has saved us, has gifted us freedom in the form of grace, and we are able to act in light of this, live for eternity because of this wonderful gift. And yes, again, we are pastors and teachers of the Word, but we all have times where we take the grace of God for granted, don't we? We all have times where we're living life and we don't even think we act out of selfishness, out of spite. Let us never forget how wonderful it is that Christ died for us. I have to admit something. I didn't come up with two interesting stories about two different men. They're actually the same person. This is the same man who was given the same freedom, who fought for his freedom and others. And because of that, he grew wise. He remembered his fallen crew. He remembered those that had fought to take away his freedom, and remembered those that he had fought for freedom. He fought for us. And he remembered the birds that gave him food while he floated on that raft and survived because of them for 47 days. So to repay them for their sacrifice, every single morning he went to that dock with his bucket of fish and threw the fish out to the birds, praying for those that he had lost, the families of those, and those that had done him wrong, that Christ might find them where they were, might touch them, and might give them freedom as he had been given. This is wisdom, and understanding the wonder of the freedom we're given through the death and resurrection of Christ, our Savior. So let's not let our questions be, can I do this or can I do that? Is that okay? Instead, let our questions be, am I taking this freedom for granted? Or is what am I doing here being wise with what I've been gifted? This is what we can learn from Paul and from our friend Tom.